inventions of various technologies. Some of us approach this question because we are interested in knowing the history of development of scientific thought and its applications, while for some of us, it is also a matter of developing a collective identity as a nation. This question of what constitutes as ancient Indian science has also been alive in our scientific institutions, in our classrooms, and even in our research. It is therefore clear that explorations of the nature and the contributions of ancient Indian science is an important pursuit. A variety of motives and desires are attached to a project of this sort. It is because of this that we find that the history of science becomes a battleground of many different ideas, interpretations, and rationalities. It is in course of such a struggle that various myths come to be constructed about Indian science. Myths by themselves are an important constituent of any society. They are often popular imaginations of the past and many a times provide a richer understanding of events than a mere listing of facts. However, when these myths begin to replace critical evaluations of our facts and premises for writing a history of science, well, that's where new challenges begin to emerge. We hope that today's discussion will throw light on the present-day conflicts and contemporary issues involved in understanding what constitutes ancient Indian science and the social context in which knowledge systems in India emerged. We feel that it is particularly important that we have such a discussion in national institutes of science, education and research, such as IITs. And therefore, we are very happy to have with us today two scientists who are not just experts in their respective fields of study, but who also have a deep understanding of relationship of science with the larger world of knowledge and society. We are looking forward to an enlightening discourse on the interface of science, knowledge and society. So without taking any more time, I would like to invite Irfan, who is a coordinator with APPSC, Ambedkar Periyar Phule Study Circle, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm extremely delighted to have our profound dignitaries in this program to address this enthused gathering. I'd like to invite the panel to be on the dais. I, on behalf of Ambedkar Periyar Phule Study Circle and Research Scholars Forum, take the educational training, a theoretical physicist. He completed his doctoral studies at State University of New York. In New York, he was an active member of Forum Science for People and had also participated in anti-war movements during the early 1970s. Dr. Vivek is the founder member of Lok Vigyan Sangatna, Maharashtra, and has been an active participant in all campaigns of the People's Science Movement since 1978. He is the founder advisor of Nirmiti, a trust devoted to universalizing elementary science and mathematics education. Dr. Monteiro has also been involved with trade union movements since 1970s and has worked with various coalitions for nuclear disarmament, peace, opposing communalism. He is the author of various scholarly and popular articles on science and technology, education, labor, energy, and power sector. I first of all thank Dr. Vivek for taking his valuable time out to be here with the panel. Professor Partho completed his PhD in biology from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and was the recipient of the Best Thesis Award from his department, and pursued his postdoctoral studies in Lerner Research Institute, Ohio. He is at present Assistant Professor, Department of Biological Sciences at the IISER, Kolkata. His work has been published in reputed international journals including Nature and Cell. He is a recipient of the prestigious Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance Intermediate Fellowship and is an associate of the Indian Academy of Science, Bangalore. When studying in IISc, he was one of the founders of the student group Concern, which is one of the longest functioning independent student group in the Science and Technology Institution. He is also the founder member and editor of the online journal Sarothi, which is devoted to analyzing the political economy of the world and contemporary issues related to democratic rights of the people of India. Professor Sarothi. Joining us as the chair today is Professor Sachin, a respected member of the faculty here at IIT Bombay, professor and former head of the Department of Chemical Engineering. With this brief introduction, I now request the chair to begin with the panel discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Monteiro for your presentation. So the format that we will follow is we'll have two presentations by two panelists, and after that, after both presentations are over, we will start the discussion with questions and answers. So, Dr. Monteiro.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers for bringing this very interesting and very challenging subject for discussion at a place like IIT. What is science? And I hope that all of us will be on the same page. So let me begin with that discussion. So what is the method of science? Basic thing is not to accept any statement on faith, question it, doubt it, put it to test. There is a test of experiment, practice, a test of logic, internal consistency, statistical validity, and it's not an individual effort. It has to be put into the public domain so that it can be viewed critically by anybody and everybody. Next. So before we agree to accept anything as a claim, if it is being made as a scientific claim, then we have to put it to test. Next. Of experience, of experiment, of internal consistency, reason, and public scrutiny. And something can be accepted as a claim to being scientific only if it is willing to put itself to this kind of a process of testing. By this definition, then, next slide. No, previous slide. Previous. Any system that is not willing to take the rigorous test of science, therefore, cannot claim to be scientifically valid, cannot claim scientific validity if it is not willing to face those tests. And astrology, therefore, cannot make a claim to be a science by this basic fundamental definition of science. Next. There was a test which was devised by 4 persons, including Professor Narlikar, Dr. Narendra Daholkar, and 2 other persons. The test was as follows. Next. The birth details of 100 bright students and 100 students who were mentally retarded were taken, and their horoscopes were prepared. And these charts were mixed and randomized. Astrologers were invited to participate. Each participant was given a random set of 40 birth charts, and they had to answer the question based on those charts. Is the person whose chart this represents, is that person mentally retarded or not? Simple question. But clearly, whether or not one is mentally challenged is going to affect your future very much. So those who want to predict the future should be able to answer this basic question. And it was found that 51 astrologers took the test, 27 sent back their assessment, and their success rate was slightly less than what one would get by just tossing a coin and making a choice. So the conclusion is that astrology does not have any predictive power. Next. By the way, there's also a prize of several lakhs of rupees that has been put up to astrologers who want to come and take a test. Only condition is that they have to put down 10,000 rupees as the entry fee and then take the test. So no astrologer has come forward to take that test. So anything that is not willing to take a scientific test cannot claim validity as in science. That is, they can make claims of validity elsewhere, but not as a claim in science. So there are some elements of the method. Everyone has the right to question. The highest authority in science is liable to be questioned by every thinking person. No sacred texts, no high priest, and must be open to be tested. By this character, next slide. Important point is that therefore, and that's something I think that all of us should understand, science is not a subject. Science is a method. It's a method of approaching validity in any area of reality. It includes both natural and social. The subject of science is the entire real world. Of course, it includes the study of matter, both living and non-living, but it also includes the study of consciousness, ethics, economics, history, and politics, because that's a part of reality. Next. Feynman, whom all of you know undoubtedly, has a nice definition. Science is a long history of learning how not to fool yourself. I will not get into a discussion about how Feynman himself abandons this definition when he gets into certain areas, but that's a different subject. That's not the subject of the talk today. A very nice definition, which I think all of us will accept. Next. So, if that is so, then science is fundamentally opposed to any form of fundamentalism. Where by fundamentalism, I mean the acceptance of something as being true because it is there in some sacred text. The text may be a religious text, but it may also be a non-religious text. The moment you accept it only because it is there as a text without questioning, that is fundamentalism. Whereas science being based on systematic disbelief is naturally and intrinsically in conflict with fundamentalism in any subject area of overlap. In a subject area where fundamentalism overlaps with science, there is a conflict. Next. And therefore, it is against any kind of obscurantism and obfuscation. Supposing, for example, wrong facts are being given, science is opposed to that, fundamentally, on basic grounds of what is science. And for example, when in media we have a lot of non-facts being presented, a lot of concocted, manipulated things being presented, videos being made and broadcast, science is fundamentally opposed to this kind of irregularity. It is opposed to any kind of obscurantism in the study of history and against any kind of myth and obscurantism in the area of economics and politics. For example, now on the question of a very current issue like demonetization. Okay? First thing one would ask if one was looking at this as a scientific question would be, let's look at the evidence. Without evidence, no conclusions will be accepted. Let's look at the evidence. Next. So, therefore, there are today, as we all know, a variety of religious fundamentalisms. We have in India the fundamentalism of Islamic variety, of Hindu variety, both of whom are based on sacred texts like Quran or Bhagavad Gita. You have to accept it without questioning. And now in America, there is with Trumpism, the fundamentalism of the Christian variety, which we are seeing becoming very active. We saw fundamentalisms earlier in Punjab. Okay? So there's a close nexus between fundamentalism, between communalism, religious fundamentalism, and terrorism based on hate politics. So scientific and science, the method of science and scientific temper is a natural and fundamental clash with all the above fundamentalisms, and therefore science is fundamentally secular because it is in opposition to this kind of approach to knowledge, approach to reality. Next. Of course, method of science has a lot to say about history. History is also a subject of science. And scientific temper makes a demand on our conduct because we are Indian citizens. Now, why scientific temper being an Indian citizen is related, we'll see a little later. It demands that we look at all reality, including history, economics, politics, critically and on the basis of evidence. So let's begin by looking at history of science, which is an aspect of history, which is very amenable to the scientific method. And I'm going to begin by looking at 2 or 3 examples of this. Next. The first subject I want to look at is Aryabhat and the value of pi. This is one of the very interesting contributions of Indian mathematical sciences to the world repository of understanding and knowledge. Aryabhat, of course, in Aryabhatiya, he has this value of pi, which is 100 plus 4 multiplied by 8 and added to 62,000. That is nearly the approximate measure of the circumference of a circle, whose diameter is 20,000. There's a sutra which says this. And if you calculate what this means, it works out to 3.1416. Okay, next. Today the value is 3.14159 something something something, as we all know. And this means that the value of pi which Aryabhat had, which is back in the 5th and 6th century, was accurate to 3.18 parts in 1 million in 10 lakhs, which is pretty good. Now, how did Aryabhat arrive at, before that there was 24.7, okay. How did Aryabhat arrive at this very accurate value of pi? One way of doing it is to make a large circle and measure the circumference divided by the diameter. Okay, and that's pi. 2 pi r divided by 2 pi is 2 pi r divided by 2 r is pi. So one way of doing it is to make larger and larger circles and measure the diameters and the circumference and divide one by the other. And it was believed that perhaps this is how Aryabhat did it. But this has to be on a flat surface. So how do you get such a big flat surface of such a large area? If it's not flat, then you have errors. How do you know that your measurement of length is accurate? So let's see how Aryabhat might have done it. Next. See, Aryabhat knew about decimal place value. He knew, and I may be wrong here, but he probably invented the procedure for getting square roots. Professor Agashe is here, I'm sure he will cast some light on that subject. Where do we have that well-known procedure of getting square roots? And you know that means, like, if you want to get square root of a number of 4 digits, that's the number of 2 digits. So So while calculating square roots, and you want to get it accuracy, you've got to go to double the number of digits to start with, and then you get half the number of digits in the square root. Okay, that's we know that Aryabhat calculated the values of sines and cosines by this method to up to 3.75 degrees, starting out with, let's say 60, then you come to 30, then you come to 15, then you come to 7.5, then you come to half of that, 3.75. So he had calculated accurately the values of sine to 3.75 degrees. And then by combining these sine A plus B is equal to formula, etc., you can get many sines of many other angles once you've got down all these basic parts. Next. Now, you put A equal to B, let's call that phi. You get this formula for sine of phi by 2 in terms of sine and cosine of phi, or in terms of sine of phi. So if I know sine 30, I can calculate sine 15. If I know sine 15, I can calculate sine 7.5. But I have to take the square root. Next. So now, this is how probably he calculated the value of sine 3.75 by going from 60 to 30 to 15 to 7.5 to 3.75, just using that golden rule, okay, which was there in the earlier slide. Next. And he had 4-figure accuracy, 4 decimal places accuracy for sine 3.75, which meant that if he used this method to calculate sine 3.75, he had to have 64 digits for sine of or cosine of 60. But that's okay. Cosine of 60 we know is half, 1 upon 2. So that you can have 64 digits. 1 upon 2 means 0.5 and then 0, 0, 0, 0, 64 digits. And now you start calculating square roots. And then you can come down to sine and cosine of 3.75 with 4 digit. Because from 60 to 30 you have 32 digits. When you come down to 30 to 15 you have 16 digits. From 15 to 7.5 you have 8 digits, and from 7.5 to 3.75 you have 4 digits at least. Okay. So you could use this method. Next. Now, for pi, calculating the value of pi, you can use essentially the same method, where what you do is you construct regular polygons, measure the circumference perimeter of the polygon, and measure the diameter of the polygon, and divide the perimeter by the diameter, and you get an approximation to pi. Because as you increase the number of sides, the polygon becomes a circle. Next. Now, it's quite easy, and I'm sure all of you here will be able to do it because you're IIT students, to calculate, starting off with, let's say, 4, and go to 8, and then go to 16, and then 32. And you get this formula just using simple school geometry that for 2 to the power of n sides, say for example 2 to the power of 4, 16 sides, then the approximation to pi is 2 to the power of n sine of pi divided by 2 to the power of n. Okay. This is something which comes out of that golden rule which we saw a couple of slides back. Very simple formula to derive. I won't take your time deriving it. Any school student, 10 standard or 11 standard, can do this calculation. So we use only square roots, and this ratio, which can be calculated to any degree of accuracy using methods invented by Aryabhat, approximates pi. Okay. But you need to know sine of pi divided by 2 to the power of n. Okay, next. So now, this is something which I did myself using a scientific calculator. not to get the value of size, but just by calculating square roots. And this is what I got. That when you go to n equal to 256 sides, then you get that ratio as 3.1415. And then you go to the next level, which is 502, the number of sides of the polygon is 512, twice 256. When you go to 512 sides, then that ratio becomes 3.14157. So I guess if Aryabhat was doing this calculation in this manner, the moment he reached 3.14157, he said, all right, now I know that this is the approximation to that is 3.1416. Okay. But he would have had to calculate square roots of a number which has 1024 decimal figures after the decimal point. So you start with 0.5 and 1024 zeros, and now you start calculating square roots, and you keep coming down to finally you get this value of pi, which is 3.14157. Next. Now that would be a long calculation, but it's doable. But the problem is, what if you make a mistake somewhere along the way? How do you know that you made a mistake or not? Supposing after doing it, after 15 steps, you make a mistake. So the way you avoid mistakes is to have not one but 10 people doing the same calculation. And after each stage, you compare the results. And if the results don't match, then you go back and check. But if all 10 have got the same answer, then you know that you've done the square root correctly. So probably next, the calculation of pi was not done by Aryabhat alone, but by a team of people working with Aryabhat. So it was a collective calculation by Aryabhat and his team. Now there are other methods about pi which are not based on calculating square roots, which are based on infinite series. And we have the formula of Madhavacharya, which is from the 14th century. And later on applied this formula, pi by 4 is equal to 1 minus 1/3 plus 1/5 minus 1/7 plus 1/9 up to infinite terms. This is a better way of calculating pi. Next. And interestingly enough, there is this work in Iran of Al-Kashi, published in 1424, where he has calculated up to 16 decimal places by a method of infinite series. And he preceded the Kerala mathematicians who also calculated the value of pi up to 10 decimal places. So what is the relationship between Aryabhat, between the Kerala School of Astronomy, and this work which is being done by Al-Kashi in what is today Iran? There is a very interesting connection which has to do with the history of those times. How knowledge goes from one part of the country to another, how it is transmitted from generation to generation. That is something which is a really interesting problem in the history of science. I'll just mention it as an interesting problem. It has to do with the relation. Why was Kerala the place where this happened? Could it have to do with the fact that there was a lot of communication between Kerala and the Arabic mathematicians of the time? Yes, there was. Did this have to do a lot with both of them using the method of infinite series? Probably yes. But what are these connections? This is something which is a problem for people who are working in the history of science. Next. Next. Now, let me take another example now, completely different. But before that, let me mention that when we are talking about the history of the mathematical sciences, something like this is a real problem in the history of mathematical science. Vedic science or Vedic mathematics does not fall into this category of ancient science. Why? Because what is called Vedic science actually is not from the time of the Vedas. As anybody, if you do a little bit of research, you will find out that what is called Vedic mathematics is something which was penned down, which was put on paper in in the 20th century. So as a branch of mathematics, that's fine, but don't call it Vedic mathematics because it has nothing to do with Vedas. It is not from that period of time. Okay, let's call it some interesting mathematics which was done in the early 20th century. Another interesting thing is, of course, plastic surgery. Plastic surgery has come into the limelight because of the contribution of our Prime Minister, who made a statement about how Lord Ganesh was the proof that our ancestors knew plastic surgery. Now, such statements are being made all the time, but normally we would not take it seriously. However, in this case, we have to take it seriously for two reasons. One is that it's made by the Prime Minister of our country. And the second was that this statement was made in a scientific audience to a group of doctors, and nobody asked a question. So the first question that we would ask of our Prime Minister is, were you making the statement as a statement in the realm of science? Because if you were, then you would have to agree to be questioned. But our Prime Minister does not ever allow come before an audience where he has to face questions. It's always man ki baat, one-way traffic. So imagine supposing our Prime Minister went before a group of students. Okay, he's always talking to students. Imagine that he went before a class of students, intelligent students, young students in school. I think the first question that they would ask him is, sir, do you know the difference between plastic surgery and organ transplant? Because Ganesh is not an example of plastic surgery. It is an example of organ transplant. Is there any instance of organ transplant in our ancient texts of Charak and Sushruta? These are the kind of questions which we would ask, but he of course does not take any questions. Anyway, let us take a real contribution of plastic surgery, and it is something which I have read in Wikipedia and also elsewhere. Apparently, plastic surgery reached Europe from India, and it's interesting to see how it reached Europe from India. This is narrated by Gunakar Phule, who's written excellent works on the history of science. Apparently, when Tipu Sultan was fighting the British, some Maratha soldiers who were fighting on the side of the British, they came to the border of where Tipu Sultan and the British were fighting, and they were captured by Tipu Sultan's men, who cut off the noses of 5 of these soldiers and sent them back to the British. Now, one of the British commanders had met a trader who had told him that his nose had been cut off as a punishment, but it had been put back by a surgeon. So this British commander went to this trader and he contacted this surgeon, and an surgery was performed somewhere near Pune by this surgeon. This surgeon, by the way, was a Maratha Vaidya from the Kumbhar caste. He was a potter by profession, who also was doing this surgery. And this is reported in the Madras Gazetteer with illustrations. It was then published, next slide, in England. This is from Wikipedia. In Gentleman's Magazine in 1794, a person, doctor by the name of Joseph Constantine Carpue, then was so impressed by this that he came to India, spent 20 years in India studying rhinoplasty, studying plastic surgery, and then he went back to Europe and introduced plastic surgery to Europe. So this is the real history of plastic surgery. Of course, there's ample mention of that in Sushruta. That is something which perhaps my next speaker will talk about. There is this beautiful book which I have here. It's written by Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, and it's called Science and Society in Ancient India, which is a wonderful discussion of Charak and Sushruta. And that is the real history of science, which the kind of statements which are being made by our Prime Minister does no justice to. It is, in fact, a travesty of our real achievements in science and our real history of science. Next. Let's take the history of aeronautics. As you know, a couple of years back, the Science Congress took place in Mumbai, and there was a paper in the Indian Science Congress presented by Captain Bodas about the achievements of aeronautics in ancient India. Now, the real history of aeronautics in India also has to do with Tipu Sultan, who defeated the British in the Second Anglo-Mysore War with rockets. And when finally Tipu Sultan was defeated in the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, and all the rockets that he had built were taken to England and studied there. They were studied by William Congreve, and they became part of the British arsenal with which they defeated the French in the Napoleonic Wars, and also they defeated the Americans. Okay? So that is the real history of aeronautics in India. Next. Now, the mythicists of Captain Anand Bodas, some of his statements: modern science is unscientific. In Vedic times, aircraft traveled through the air from one country to another, from one continent to another continent, from one planet to another planet, and could move left, right, as well as backward. And these claims were made in a text called Vaimanika Shastra, written in modern Sanskrit in early 20th century, just like Vedic mathematics. Okay? They are not ancient texts, they were written in the 20th century. Of course, Shastri claimed that Rishi Bhardwaj had dictated this text to him when he was in some kind of a psychic trance. So that was claimed then. Next. Now, it's often sometimes said by the votaries of an approach to ancient science says that, see, there is Indian science and there is Western science. And our science is not Western science. Okay? My question is, people who make such statements really do not seem to know our own history of science. What do we mean by science? Well, these are the things. It has a materialist basis. We go by material evidence. It is evidence-based. It's based on reasoning, collective discussion, practice, and experiment, and internal consistency, theory and consistency. There has to be all these things, only then we say it is science. But is this Western? Next slide. Here's something from 2,500 years back. And Gautam Buddha, he says, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because be an atheist if you want, but do not believe in anything unquestionably. Now, are these Western imports? Is Buddha a Western import? Is Vivekananda a Western import? But what they are saying is essentially the statement about science. Okay, I'll quickly conclude now. I think the signal is... So now, as citizens, we are of course mandated to have a method of science, because in our constitution, Article 51A says to develop the scientific method of humanism is a fundamental duty of every Indian citizen. Next. And we know that in this, at the same time, a person like Dr. Dabholkar was the author of that paper with Professor Dabholkar. He was killed on 3 years back by fundamentalist terrorist elements. At that time, on that day, All India People's Science Network was having a meeting in Bangalore. So we passed this resolution, which is that we pledge to combat the forces of communal fascism and terrorism acting in the name of religion, which are active in different parts of our country today. We affirm the values of the Indian Constitution of scientific temper, secularism, equality, and democracy, and will work to carry their message to every school, to every town and village of our So today we find that there is a systematic attack which is taking place on those who are promoting scientific thinking and scientific values. Not just in our country. There is Navalkar, there is Pansare, there is Kalburi, but also today in America, okay, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, these attacks are taking place against those who are promoting scientific thinking. So it is not accidental. Okay? Why this is taking place is a scientific question which we have to look at scientifically. Next. But the important thing is, one of the important reasons why these attacks are taking place is to try to shrink the democratic space. The message that is intended to be delivered is that keep quiet. Don't ask questions. Don't ask uncomfortable questions. So our response obviously has to be, if you are believing in science, that no, we will respond even more vigorously in the sense of the resolution of the Organized People Science Network. And after Pansare was killed, this is what we did. We went to Bhandup station and there was this handbill here which we printed 10,000 copies and we distributed this handbill to all the people who were coming off the trains containing the writings of Pansare. So the attempt was to silence Pansare, but we ensured that his thoughts reached an even wider audience. So this is how we must respond. They should not be able to shrink the space, but when we respond like this, the space actually expands. That is what was attempted against at JNU also, when they wanted to, attack a person like Kanhaiya Kumar. But the way that it was resisted, actually the space was widened because of the films picked up by people like Kanhaiya Kumar. So that is what we have to do. We have to respond vigorously, respond scientifically. And I think I would like to appeal to all of you, thank all the organizers here for bringing me here. I would like to appeal to all of you to do this. One last appeal I would like to make to all of you, because you are the people who are technically trained for this, that all this material is not available on the internet. Ample material. I can download excellent stuff from Library Genesis, but all this stuff is not available. So maybe some of you can help to scan this and put it up on the internet so it's available to wider audiences, and all of us can work together to take this to wider audiences, because as Indian citizens, that is what we have to do. Thank you very much.
Thanking the organizers, the Ambedkar, Periyar, Phule Study Circle and the Research Scholars Forum for organizing this discussion. The genesis of the idea for this discussion or of this meeting actually originated in a meeting which I had with them a couple of months back when I was visiting your institute, when we were talking about how we should approach the development of science in India and the world, because that is not something which we as like practicing scientists or technologists really think about. So we are sort of carried away by the practice of our day-to-day work, like studying, researching, publishing, and we do not think of the bigger trajectories of the broader concerns which science has always generated. And as my previous speaker, Dr. Monteiro, has said very so correctly, that this question about the conflict on issues pertaining to science, what science really pertains to, what are the values it brings in front of us, is raging all over the world. It's not only in India. We have seen that, for example, in the West, in the USA, there has been this, this big struggle between evolutionists and creationists. Where there is a whole school of thought which is actually taught in schools also, where evolution is debunked and creationism in various forms, starting from intelligent design, like a short, brief Earth history, is taught in schools. So similarly, we have seen that there has been a tradition of this in India also, where various claims, various myths have been propagated in the name of science. And very rarely have practicing scientists really responded or like stood up against this. And that is a responsibility which all of us have. So people like Meghnad Saha, who was a great practicing scientist, one of the, like the founding fathers of science in India, he, among all his busy schedule, actually wrote a booklet which is no more available, which says whose name in Bengali is a sort of a satire. It says that Shop Bede Ase, which means that everything is in the Vedas. This is a sort of a satire on this what has been going on for a long time in our country, that everything is in the Vedas. Okay? And it took us time to write that. We do not do that anymore. Okay? And therefore, I think we have to develop this practice, which Dr. Monteiro has talked about today, where we speak among ourselves about the broader trajectories of science, what are the issues about which we are concerned in science, because science is not just the prerogative of a set of people who are working in the labs, or a set of people who are teaching it in classrooms or colleges, universities, institutes like this, or a set of technocrats sitting in North Block, South Block, wherever they are, and deciding science policy. It's a prerogative of all of us, and it's a prerogative of the common people of the country also. So that is why where the genesis of such a program, such a discussion comes up. I would not attempt, to sort of cover the development of Indian science per se in ancient India, because that has a rich and varied tradition. It's a long history, and Dr. Monteiro has given us glimpses of that, very interesting glimpses taken from mathematics, from rhinoplasty, plastic surgery of the nose, ear, etc. But these are just facets of it. What I would like to sort of talk about is to talk in broad strokes about the general trajectory which science followed in ancient India, and look at the various periods and why there has been a decline in the scientific tradition or the scientific trajectory over a certain period of time. Because I think a lot of these claims about this ancient greatness of Indian science comes from trying to rationalize, trying to explain or trying to counter this actual decline which has been in Indian science from around the 9th to 10th centuries. And nationalist politics has taken that up, and as if that is something which is for us to be ashamed of, and therefore we should counter it by making sort of outlandish claims of what was there before that. So that is the sort of the historical project which we are looking at, where the science becomes an issue of conflict, of controversy, of contention. But this decline in Indian science also has its social, political, cultural, historical basis, and it is important for us to understand those bases in order to understand or to develop science in today's India also. So I will talk a little bit about that also, because I think that is a very important part of our understanding of Indian science. So if we look at the overall development of Indian science, I would sort of divide it arbitrarily into sort of a phase which would coincide with the Indus Valley, the period when the civilization developed, which was there. It was followed by what is generally called as the Vedic period, which is where we do not have any more, and that is a big, a very big change. We do not have written records anymore because there was no writing, and that is something which actually differentiates this Vedic the period from the pre-Vedic Indus Valley period, and sort of debunks the idea that the Vedic period was sort of a continuation or was actually the Indus Valley period, because there is really no writing in that period. Writing reappears in India after a period of nearly 1,000 years, in around 300 or 400 BC, in some of this Bhurja Patra, the birch leaf manuscripts, and later the Ashokan pillar inscriptions which are in Brahmi, Kharosthi, etc. So this period, this Vedic period, also saw developments in science, and we should understand that these developments are based on the needs, the practices of the people who were from that period. These people didn't really require, aeroplanes to fly from place to place. So therefore, really there was no development of flying machines or Brahmastra or Pashupatastra to do mass killing, etc. There was no need for these things. Rather, what were the type of needs which were there? There were needs for building sacrificial altars, the Yagna Vedis, okay? And there's a whole set of texts which are called as the Surva Sutras were there as a part of the Vedanta, parts of the Vedas, which described, like geometrical methods, formulae for designing this sacrificial altars. And among them, for example, is this Bodhaya Surva Sutra, where we actually find the first formal enunciation of the Pythagorean theorem. When he said that the area of a diagonal of a rectangle is equal to the sum of the areas of the two sides of the rectangle. But we should again remember that science is never really a national project. Science develops, by exchange, by intermingling of ideas over vast areas. So it is not just that science is globalized today, where we have papers being published on the internet and being read and followed by authors everywhere. For example, if we just take this question of Pythagorean triplets, what we see is that the Egyptians definitely had some idea about it because some of their designs of pyramids follows Pythagorean triplets. There was a formal enunciation of it, as I said, in the Bodhaya Surva Sutra. But then in around 500 BC, we see a series of Pythagorean triplets in Chinese texts. Okay. And what Pythagoras did was to really give a rigorous mathematical, like a theorem describing this thing, which was finally published in Euclid's Geometry, where he gave the name of Pythagoras. So you can see different cultures would have come up with the same thing because it was required for their own purposes. So this is the way, like science developed during this period. And then there were also a development of astronomy, because you can understand that the people of the Vedic period who actually started off as animal herders, because that is what all the Vedas are about. If you read the Rig Veda or the Sam Veda, you will see that it's a pastoral culture we are talking of, where the cow, the horse, etc. are the most important. The word Gandhi actually means over their wealth. Okay, that's the wealth was equated to the cow. And then the transition into an agricultural society where they required to develop a calendar, for planting, harvesting, reaping, etc. for all these practices. And this gave rise to the practice of studying the movement of stars, planets, heavenly bodies, etc., which was the basis of development of astronomy. And this is what Jyotisha is. It is very interesting that Jyotisha in Indian texts, till the post-Vedic period, what is called the Siddhantic period, had no connection with astrology. It was never used, for example, to predict, people, what would happen in people's lives, how stars and planets affect people's lives. It was completely astronomy, and Jyotisha, which means astrology, was actually imported into Indian texts from Mesopotamia. It is very clear. And there is a big time difference between this, between these phases. So astronomy was basically, like studying the movement of the stars, planets, etc. And they developed enough sophistication to, for example, find the sidereal period of various planets, sidereal period, how long it takes for them to make a revolution, etc., which was done during the Vedic period. Again, you can understand that this was the motivation, the impulse was the social needs, the cultural needs, the economic needs, which actually gave rise to this developments we see in science. So then I would come to the period just after so towards the end of this Vedic period, there was a big turmoil in the intellectual field in India, the time when actually Buddhism and Jainism actually emerged as forces challenging the hegemony of Vedic Brahmanism. And there's also that it was not just that it was Buddhism and Jainism which was there. There was a lot of contention during this period. There were philosophies which are absolutely materialistic philosophies, as against the very spiritualist philosophy which was being propagated by the Vedantic, like the texts like the Upanishads. So this philosophy, for example, represented by the Charvakvadis in Lokayata philosophy, or for example, even in this philosophy such as Sankhya or Vaisheshika, which actually talked of material basis of natural phenomena. And then, as Dr. Monteiro said, Buddha and Mahavira actually, completely negated divine influence in material, in phenomena in men's lives. It was also the period when there were many lesser known people, like whose names are nowadays forgotten about, like people like Ajit Kesh Kambali, Puran Kashyap, who were thinkers and seers who used to travel all around India, debating, discussing about these various types of materialist philosophies. Their names are not mentioned in our history books actually. They were contemporaries of Buddha and Mahavira. And this lively debate actually gave rise to an intellectual atmosphere which gave a spur to Indian science in the post-Vedic period. And this spur to Indian science over a period of around, so starting from I would say around 400 BC till I would say 900 to or 1080, a total period of nearly 1500 years, saw these great developments in ancient Indian science in various forms, and the product of that is Aryabhatta, Varahamihir, Brahmagupta, Bhaskara, etc., whom we talk about. And this period is generally called as a Siddhantic period because there were a number of these texts during this period, mostly associated with astronomy, but also other things which were called as the Siddhantas. So there was this, so Siddhanta is not just one book. Surya Siddhanta is a famous book by Aryabhatta, but there were many others, like Vashishta Siddhanta, Pitamaha Siddhanta, etc., which tried to put together the astronomical, like the knowledge of that period and also try to develop new astronomical knowledges. And you have seen that the type of the product, like deciphering the value of pi, and then also developing, very importantly, the decimal place value system and zero, okay, which came from this period. Actually, this is a big difference between the Vedic period and the post-Vedic period, which actually debunks this claim of Vedic mathematics, because all of the Vedic mathematics sutras, which is this book, which came from these books published by what Dr. Monteiro was talking about, by Jagadguru Shankaracharya Sri Krishna Tirtharji Maharaj of Govardhan Peeth of Puri in 1965. That is where Vedic mathematics actually was first time heard about. That has entire thing in decimals and place value systems. Place value systems means that you have numbers which are in units, tens, hundreds, thousands, etc. But if you actually go to see the text during the Vedic period, for example, the Summa Sutras, there was no place value system over there. So there was numbers from 1 to 9, there are number for 10, and then it was like 10 plus 1, 10 plus 2, up to 19, then again another number for 20, which was a similar way what was there in the Greco-Roman, like the number system. So the place value system developed much later, and today people who claim that this is Vedic mathematics don't even know this basic, like the information that the place value system was not there during the Vedic. So actually, when the story goes that the Swami Bharati Krishna Tirthaji, when he wrote this book, it was actually published posthumously in 1965. He was asked so he said that this Vedic mathematics is there in a Parishishta, an appendix of the Atharva Veda. Okay, and then when this Dr. S.N. Shukla asked him that where is the Parishishta, because it couldn't be found in the Atharva Veda, he said it is in my Parishishta. It is not in everybody's Parishishta. So basically, so that is how, therefore, Vedic mathematics, what we call, or what is talked about today, and what the government is now trying to teach in schools apparently, this is just easy ways of doing some calculation, which has got nothing to do with actually how mathematics developed in ancient India. So anyway, coming to the Siddhantic period, we see this great development in mathematics, astronomy, and related fields. There was a great development also in medicine, okay, which is embodied by the works of Charaka, Shushruta, Jivaka, Atreya, Nagarjuna, etc. We know these names. Some of the texts are there. There was development in chemistry. There is this whole text of this Rasa text, Rasa Ratna Manjari, Rasa Hridaya, etc., which are basically to do with practices in chemistry, which included everything from alchemy. You can understand that alchemy has always been one of the like the motivations in chemistry, trying to produce gold from other baser metals and to produce the amruta, the elixir of life. This was also motivation in India. That actually tells us that the motivations of this are similar in different cultures. But then it goes on to talk about properties of different metals, how metals can be incinerated to produce, like ash, which has different chemical properties from the metals, how this can be developed for medicinal purposes. So there was a direct connection between chemistry and medicine. And then surgery developed together with this practice of vivisection, that means the dissection of cadavers, okay, which has been described in the text by Bhagavad. So there has been a vivisection during that period. So there was this development in chemistry, medicine, description of medicinal properties of plants, etc. So this Siddhantic period sort of continued till, like the works of Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya, who came like in the 12th century. But what we see then, that from around the 10th century, there was a major decline in the scientific activity in India. Okay? And today's, like the people who talk the same thing about how great was Vedic science, etc., they attribute this decline to foreign invasions and wholesale destruction of, like scientific texts, universities, etc. The first mistake they do is a chronological mistake, because we can clearly sort of trace this decline to the 9th century, that is at least 300 years before the first time there were invasions during that period from the Arabs or from the Afghan Turks. And the second thing is that the people who were supposed to be doing these invasions, alright, the Arabs, for example, Muhammad bin Qasim, the first Arab to invade, they were actually running an empire stretching from Iran over here in Persia to Spain in Europe, which was dotted by universities which were studying Indian and Greek science. There were universities starting from Nishapur in Iran to Cordoba in Spain, where there was an active interest in Indian and Greek, Chinese science, etc. So there was no question. So this started in the 12th century, and it is now known that actually the first time, and it is recorded that this India, the idea of zero and the decimal system was presented to a non-Indian audience, was in a scientific conference called in Baghdad by the second Abbasid Khalif Mansur, who called a scientific conference to inaugurate his own rule. So you can understand an Islamic Khalif calling a scientific conference, calling scientists from different parts of the world, China, Iran, India, Greece, Syria, etc., to inaugurate his rule as a descendant of the Prophet, or as a successor of Prophet Muhammad. And in that conference, an Indian called Kankha apparently for the first time presented the idea of the decimal system and zero to a non-Indian audience, from which it was transmitted to the Arab mathematicians, who developed the system as the Hindu-Arabic numeral, by which name we still know it today. So therefore, we have to understand that two things: why there was this decline in Indian science during this period, and the second thing, which is a very important question, why there was never a development of experimental science in India during the entire period, and as a result of which we did not have the type of effervescence in science which happened in Europe in the post-Renaissance Enlightenment period. So people have thought about it because it's a very worrisome thing. And why didn't experimental science develop? And why did we see this decline of science? And a person who had written about it was Acharya Prafulla Chandra Roy, who was a chemist working in Calcutta, who was, his students became the directors of all the IITs when the IITs were set up. His student Gyan Ghosh became the first director of IIT Kharagpur when IIT was set up. So he actually developed a whole generation of Indian scientists who carried on his tradition. So he wrote a magnum opus called The History of Hindu Chemistry, okay, and where he actually traced this 4 or 3 different reasons why experimental and inductive sciences didn't develop. And then there are the later work which has supported these ideas, and I think very seriously about these things. So the major reason why I think, and what Prafulla Chandra Roy thought, experimental science didn't develop in India was because of the caste system. A single word, the caste system. This is because there was a direct separation between the theoreticians and practitioners in India. Only the Brahmins had this monopoly over knowledge, which was textual knowledge, which was theoretical knowledge, which was written in the Sulva Sutras, to the Siddhantas, etc., etc. Whereas the practitioners, people who would really be working with their hands, who would be actually seeing natural phenomena with their eyes, would be the artisan class, who are all Dalits and untouchables. And the caste system prevented the any collaboration between these two castes. It didn't even allow interaction between these castes. So there was no scope in India for an intersection between the theoretical developments in astronomy, mathematics, etc. which was happening, to actually intersect with the practices of physics, chemistry, etc., metallurgy, etc., which was being practiced by this artisan class, who were all Dalits and untouchables in that way. And actually we see that this caste system, and today, like last year a paper was published where, by doing genetic analysis, now we know that the caste system was actually rigidified during the Gupta period, the Siddhantic period, from which time we see actually the decline, the post which time the decline of Indian science. So this was something which didn't happen in Europe during the Enlightenment period. Today we talk about Galileo and how Galileo discovered, about the heliocentric solar system, but we forget that he used a telescope for this purpose. And Galileo had no way of developing a telescope, making a telescope. For that, he was dependent on the glass blowers of Venice, who would make glass utensils, whom he collaborated with, and they made the lenses for him, which used in his telescope. Okay? And Galileo has thanked them for that. We have no such collaboration over here between people like Aryabhatta or a glassmaker in India who would develop lenses for him, because they were untouchable. Because if the person's shadow fell on Aryabhatta would have to go and take a bath in the Ganga or whatever river was nearby. So this caste system, which today still has its has its dark shadow on us, actually prevented the development of practical, of experimental inductive sciences in India. And this is has been one of our major misfortunes. So, and as the caste system was rigidified, this decline was further accentuated and further accelerated. And that is one of the reasons why we see this decline from the 8 to 9 centuries. This is one of the reasons. The second reason was that during this Siddhantic period, slowly we see that the monopoly or the hegemony of the Shastras took over the social sphere. Before that, we did not have the Shastras, the Manusmriti and other codes which laid down the code of conduct of people. Once this code of conduct of people were laid down, there were clear do's and don'ts, yes and no's for various practices. For example, in Manusmriti it is there that if a Brahmin touches a dead body, he would fall to the condition of a Chandala. Chandala is the people who actually cremate dead bodies. So, till before that we have seen Bhagavata, who is actually telling to do vivisection, to do dissection of cadavers, to understand the anatomy and physiology. And then we see this Shastras telling that a Brahmin who is actually studying the text of Bhagavata cannot touch a cadaver, because then he will fall to the condition of a Chandala. So this Shastras set up this very rigid code of do's and don'ts during this period from this 5th, 6th century, which completely became a suffocating, like a burden on the development of experimental scientific practices in India. This is the second reason. So there was nowhere else there was this type of strong codes of conduct. The third thing, which was also a very important thing, and this was in the philosophical sphere. As we have discussed briefly, that there were strong currents of materialist philosophy which were looking at, the material basis of natural phenomena for various things. And this has been, for example, we proudly talk of Kanad, after whom Kana, the particle, is named, because he mentioned about fundamental particles in his Sankhya texts. But then what happened around the 9th century, a very influential, a thought leader emerged in Indian scenario, that was the Adi Shankaracharya, who focused on Vedantic philosophy, the philosophy of Vishishta Advaita, which focused on Mayavad, whose basis was that the material world is illusion, and it it is the world beyond which is real. And this had a chilling influence over all materialist philosophy in India. So Shankaracharya traveled the length and breadth of India, debating with people, and he took this, with our history of the spirit, replete with the debating victories, the triumphs of Shankaracharya over his his rivals, and his rivals were these people with materialist philosophies. If you read the Shankara Bhashya of the Vedas, you see the criticism he has for Kanad. He specifically tells that Kanad is trying to pollute minds of people are bringing in this idea of this fundamental particle Kana, because there is no such fundamental particle. So this development, and that became the sort of reigning philosophy of India, and that has continued till date, I would say, where materialism was replaced by a false spiritualism, a spiritualism which sort of prevented people from recognizing material reality. So this also P.C. Roy identifies as a very important philosophical, attack on the development of Indian science. And all of this coincides with the time when we see that the development of decline of Indian science. And the fourth thing, which I think is important, is the destruction or the de-mainstreaming of Buddhism, which also happened around this time. See, actually today we see that who were the people who were doing these medical practices. All these people like Charaka, Jivaka, etc., we see they were actually all Buddhists. So Buddhists had this, practices of doing chemistry, of doing medicine, etc. So in the 8th, 9th century, when Buddhism was actually defeated, I would say, and was actually forced to go underground, all these scientific practices were de-mainstreamed. And for example, chemistry, today, what we see is that the chemistry of that period actually went underground and became part of Tantra Vidya. So tantric ritual still uses things like metals like mercury, metal ashes, etc., which are all remnants of the Buddhistic practices which were being in chemistry, etc. So that is the de-mainstreaming and the sort of subversion of Buddhism which happened. I also think has a very important effect on the decline of Indian science. So this is the thing which we should try to understand, because all these are important messages for us today also. The other important message by which I would like to end my presentation, my talk, is that again, science is not something, it's not a national project as our leaders are trying to claim, and what has been the sort of claim in independent India. It is not an international project. Science always develops by collaborations, by exchanges, by traveling over borders and boundaries, because science is something, it's a system of practice, a system of knowledge which cannot be held in one country, and therefore it is sort of a mistaken effort to actually look at like science in one country and how great a country was in science. And India actually played a very important role as being like a focal point in the crossroads in these exchanges. India was the place from where a lot of knowledge actually traveled through the hands of Arabs, actually, Islamic, scientists, and went into Europe, and today has become modern science. And I'll just give one example, which is a very interesting example, that is alcohol. All of you know about alcohol. The alcohol, stands, it's actually an English word, but it's originally an Arab word which stands for al-kohal. Al, is the Arabic the, which you find in all like al-Qaeda, So al-kohal means the kohal. And kohal is a Sanskrit word. If you go to the Rasaratna Sara of the 2nd century, you will see alcohol being described as kohal. The word kohal means the liquid of knowledge. Ko means knowledge and hal means liquid. Okay? So al-kohal is a joint or a conjunct Arabic Sanskrit word which means the liquid of knowledge. Okay? So why is it like this? It is not because if you drink alcohol you get some esoteric knowledge. That is not the reason. The reason is that producing wine, like producing liquor by fermentation, developed independent in every single culture in the world. Every single culture who grew any carbohydrate-rich crop, any cereal, would ferment it and would produce different types of wine. So you get like whiskey, vodka, sake, feni, hadia, etc., all over the world. But the knowledge, the technique of distilling that, to heating it and then condensing it, to purify the alcoholic content of that was actually discovered in India. Okay? And it was a closely guarded secret. Right? So no one knew about it because it was a closely guarded secret among the set of chemists who developed this thing. And if you read about the description, they were actually sort of amazed by the properties of this thing. So in this ancient chemistry books, alcohol is described as Varunagni because they found that it was a liquid which was cool to the touch but which would catch fire. So they are describing it as the thing where both Varuna and Agni resides together. Okay? So what happened was that in this 11th, 12th century, when we are telling that the Arabs are coming and destroying our universities, somewhere in the northwest, for example, possibly in Takshashila University, some Arab, postdoc possibly, learned it from some Buddhist professor in Takshashila University, the technique of distillation, and took it all the way to Spain, possibly in Cordoba, from where it was transmitted to the European alchemists, where we get the name of alcohol. So this is how science develops. Science doesn't develop in one country. And on a visit to the University of Cordoba, in the museum, I saw there was a text, a Greek text which was written over there. It's a Greek translation of an Indian text called the Rasarudaya. So I talked with the curator and said, can you show me what this text is? So he got it out and I saw, and it was the Greek translation of an Indian chemistry text, originally written in Sanskrit, done by an Arab scientist who was Jewish by religion. Okay? And that is my ending statement. That is what science is about. That is how science develops, and that is how we will have to develop science. Thank you.
All I am going to do is address the tail end. One thing is, which we are saying that scholarly knowledge in India was esoteric. And that's the reason the British also looked down upon it. And there was something to it, because they said, this stuff is all believed with the other world, why do you bother about it? So that's the reason. And before we blame distinction between these, let me point out that when Frederick Taylor stated what he called scientific management, he gave the concept of separation between thinkers and goals. Similarly, Manusmriti was no code of conduct. It was designated as code of conduct by the British because they wanted an established code of conduct. So that is the reason why Manusmriti is unduly given too much weight, which it doesn't simply deserve. There are lots of other things also. Hopefully, sometime later, I should be able to catch up on them later. Thank you for the session. And because I am aware that if I go and make such a presentation in my class will contradict me. So maybe that is a place where I look forward to more contradictions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let me invite more comments, more questions. Yeah, so let's get them and then respond collectively.
This presentation mostly I think it was more on against the Vedas. Some people have given a misconception that what is there in the Vedas, but it was mostly towards against the Vedas. I think that in the Vedas also there are many things which are given which are scientific. Just like in the Srimad Bhagavad Puran, in the 7th canto, it is explained that how the planets are arranged. And recently there is this Vedic planetarium being constructed by Alfred Fords International in the state of West Bengal, Mayapur. So in there they are trying to explain according to the Bhagavatam that how these planets are arranged. Okay, and then also in the Srimad Bhagavatam it is given that how a child is born inside the womb of a mother. Okay, so like these are some of the few examples that I have given, but there are so many other examples which are there in the scripture which are according which are according to the scientific things, and like even which science cannot explain today. And also other thing that in the first slide show that sir said that science is not fake. But when I was a school kid, I was being taught that there are some atoms, there are some neutrons, but I have never seen them. Okay, and they also they have not taught me that there is a base point Japan or so many other things. Okay, so I have not seen that. So it was basis of the faith that yes, because my teacher is explaining me, so like something like this exists. Okay, somewhere. So just like Brahmasmi, I am not this body, I am the spirit soul. It cannot be explained. It cannot.
Can you make it very succinct?
So my only question is that there are few things in the scriptures which cannot be seen, just like that soul cannot be seen. But there are so many things we can explain in the concept of soul. So I don't completely agree with what you said that everything has to be seen. I mean like that is like one of the points. And also you have diminished the value of the Vedas. And where there are actually so many things which are scientific, as I gave those two examples. So I would like to have some view on that. Your views.
See, I think the only statement I made about the Vedas in my presentation was that Vedic mathematics is not in the Vedas. I think that we can agree upon, right? About the statement about the relationship between science and faith, I would like to add that as long as a statement is not being made as a scientific statement, there may not be a conflict between that statement and science. The problem comes when some statements which are there in the so-called sacred texts, they are made as claims to science. वहाँ पर तो testing तो होगा, and any statement which is being made with a claim to being scientific, that should be prepared to be subjected to a whole battery and a whole range of tests. That is the statement that I am telling you. Now, as far as the Vedas are concerned, or the Bible, or the Quran, or all these texts which claim to be eternal, yes, science has an issue with that. Because science would say that, well, if you believe in the theory of evolution, then what was the status of these texts for all those very hundreds and thousands and lakhs and crores and hundreds of crores of years when there were no human beings on earth? Did these texts exist? Is there religion on the moon? Is there religion on all those planets which are not inhabited? So religion and all these texts only come into the picture after human beings enter in the whole scheme of evolution. And therefore, as a scientist, I would say that if you want to look at these texts scientifically, you would like to see how is it that human beings created these texts. I think I would, if that is diminishing the value of these texts, yes, but that is how, if you believe in science and if you believe that everything has a history and understanding something is understanding its history, well, that is where we lead up. Science and religion are not in conflict if religion is not making statements claiming to be scientific. And in fact, there are many values of religions which are very much compatible with the values of science, as for example what Buddha was saying, as for example what Sant Tukaram says. Sant Tukaram also makes statements about asking questions, not accepting things. So there is no conflict there, there are common values. But when there is an overlap, then yes, there is a, for example, in science, there is no miracle. Anything making a claim to having a miracle as a scientific statement, वहाँ पर तो conflict तो होगा ही. And it has to be subjected to then test.
Yeah, I think what our friend is telling is that there are a lot of knowledge in the scriptures. The scriptures were written or came down at a certain time and it has things which pertains to that time. There is no point trying to get meaning out of it which is not temporally, chronologically, spatially correct. And I think that is the problem in our effort. I have visited that planetarium which IIScon is setting up in Mayapur. My institute is in the same district, Nadia district. My institute is like 30 kilometers from Mayapur. And in the planetarium they're talking about the 9 planets, possibly which comes from Bhagavatam. And what are these 9 planets? The 9 planets includes the sun and the moon. One of which we know is a star, the other is a satellite. And it includes 2 shadows also, Rahu and Ketu, which are the shadow of the earth on the moon and the shadow of the moon on the sun. So if I have to follow that is there in the Bhagavata, and we now know that about the 9 planets, 2 are satellites and stars and 2 are just mere shadows, which are figments of imagination, then there is no question of actually having any objective basis of understanding. Then it completely becomes of blindly going by what scriptures say. And scriptures, again, we should understand, as I said, they are a product of a time and space. And there are various ways in which things have been interpreted. And there has been this attempt of trying to find meaning which is not there at all. So I like to quote this basically. This one is a thing which was actually written by Dayanand Saraswati in his Rigveda Bhashya Bhumika. So he wrote a Bhashya, a commentary on the Rigveda. In introduction, he refers to this Sukta from the Ashtam Mandala, 3rd Adhyaya, 4th Varga, that Trayas Ambhasas Kavita Sarabhe, Trinaktam Yatharas Nityasha Tina Diva. From which he says that this means that there were aircrafts going from one island to another in 3 days and nights. This is his interpretation. When I go back to the 12th century and see Sayanacharya's commentary, the same commentary, his interpretation of this Sukta is that there are 3 wheels to your honey-bearing chariot, as all the gods have known it to be when attending the marriage of Vena, the beloved of Soma. O Ashwins, there are 3 pillars fixed in the chariot for support, and in it thrice you drive by night and thrice by day. So, if a person wants to interpret it as that there is, there are aircrafts which is flying from island to island, and when we see that someone in the 12th century who doesn't know about aircrafts, okay, completely, interprets in a different way, then the entire thing comes to interpretation. And therefore, I think as students of science, technology, etc., we should not misinterpret things. We should try to use our knowledge, our understanding in order to develop this thing. There's no point of, accepting 9 planets just because the number is same, but although the planets are different.
First of all, we are not very loud.
So can we take other questions and then we can continue? Yeah?
Can I speak without
Yeah, you can hear you.
Yeah, I actually wanted to add to something that you have been saying. One of the problems in reinterpreting or misinterpreting the scriptures is that we selectively look at things that we want to look at. So for instance, when people look at the Vedas and try to see some cosmogenesis or origin of universe theory, we find that there are actually 4 statements. But we choose one which sits well, or the interpretation of which sits well with the Big Bang theory. So there is also this, using selectively interpreting parts of the Vedas while completely ignoring the parts which don't fit with the scientific worldview. This is like where I would probably agree with you, where probably I would have some of my divergences. When you're talking about the sacking of Indian universities, now whether or not they were universities in the strict sense, that is open to question. But we cannot deny that there was a sacking indeed that happened of Nalanda and Vikramshila. One of the spillover effects was that in Tibet, Buddhism flourished, the scriptures went to Tibet. So, yeah.
So I didn't get your question. What do you want to do?
Now, the first is a comment in which I'm actually supporting that there is a aspect of selectively reading the books or the text. The second is that we should not also try to downplay certain external factors for whatever political ideological reasons, which actually did lead to a decline of scientific temper in the country.
So, do you want to respond to this?
Yeah. So this question of sacking of universities is not really an established fact in any way. Means we can talk about the history. The only reference to that is in this Riyasat Salatin by Ibn Battuta, who was following Muhammad this was Bing Bakhtiyar Khilji, who has been accused of sucking this thing. But there it is very clearly written, nowhere is Nalanda, Vikramshila, etc. mentioned. There has been given this thing about a place called Udantapuri, which was destroyed, okay, and which apparently had many books. So Nalanda and Vikramshila being identified as universities which were sacked is a historical misstatement. There is no record of that. Actually, this has been sort of, no.
So if
The other thing is that this traveling of Buddhist texts to China and Tibet started in the 4th century. So, like we see people like Atish Dipankar, Shil Bhadra, etc. having connections with Tibet and China at least 600 years before the coming of, people like Bing Bakhtiyar Khilji to that area. So, trying to coincide, widely divergent timescales, because just, we can pick and choose names of places, people, etc. And when general people do not know this actual timescale, etc., has been what has been the bane of, our way of, studying or talking about history. The reality is that there has always been an exchange between Tibet and Bengal in that part. Tibetan king Shokshan Gampo came and invaded Bengal once in the 6th century and fought with the Pala rulers of Bengal. And apparently when he went back, the Pala ruler asked him, what do you want to take with him? He said, I want to take 20 scholars with me. So 20 scholars went with him. So this type of thinking, this type of sort of developing this false cause and correlation effects, I think is not very helpful in this context. We should try to develop a scientific historiography and a study of history, which definitely is an important thing for our understanding of our past also.
Hello, sir.
Please go.
So, first of all, it was a very informative talk by both the speakers. I had one perspective, not a criticism. I wanted you to, if anyone of you can reflect upon it. So, I don't come from a humanities background, so I might be ill-informed, but I was reading a paper about oral cultures where the written communication was very limited or almost absent. And they talked about the idea of mythology. And what they said was that the reason you see the mythology in such a way is because they had to remember the mythology by speaking about it, repetitively. So if you don't make it spectacular, for example, if you don't talk about Ram, creating a bridge and then, using a Vanara Sena and going and invading something, then people, if it was a normal, battle which did not have anything spectacular about it, people eventually forget it. So to remember it and to carry on for generations, it has to be made in such a way that people can remember it, and that's why you add all those adjectives to it. So probably in that culture where there was only oral source of generating knowledge and retaining knowledge, it made sense. But in today's time when we have language and written text, probably we need to relook at the frame at which we revisit this kind of scriptures. Yeah, I'm not an expert of history, but I would say that these various historical myths, mythologies, not only in our Indian culture but all over the world, they are very interesting documents which have to be looked at as giving hints of the times in which they were written. If you look at these documents in that light, there is no problem. Which means that we are prepared to look at these documents critically. We are prepared to sift what is, imagination from what is the events of the times. So we are prepared to look critically at those documents. As long as that is done, I think there is no problem. And certainly, as part of our study of history, along with all the other evidence, we should look at also the oral evidence and the oral traditions which have come from those times. But as I said, I am not an expert, I have not done that analysis. But just as a person who would look at reality with a scientific point of view, this is what I would like to say.
Yeah, I think you have raised a very valid point. It is actually not accepted in evolutionary biology and animal behavior studies This is called a super stimulation. So, like bird chicks in the nest have much bigger mouth size compared to their body size, and they have very vivid colors on the inside of the mouth, like very vivid red colors. This acts as a super stimulation on the mother or father bird when it brings in food, so that it puts the food into the mouth. Because birds have very small memories, the bird brain have come like that. So it is sort of a super stimulation on them in order to remember when to put the food in. So that is why, like if Ravan had one head, we would have to have remembered it so vividly when Ravan has 10 heads. It is super stimulation. This super stimulation is a very important thing in culture, just as it is in animal behavior. Because that is how facts and figures are actually transmitted from generation to generation. So this, and nowadays we know genetically also that birds have this ability to specifically recognize that if you give them a false, like a mouth like that, they would come and put their food in that, just based on the size and the color of that mouth. So super stimulation is definitely an important phenomenon in cultural, inheritance also.
Hello sir, thanks for an amazing discussion, perhaps talk from both of you. So Dr. Vivek mentioned about scientific temper and scientific thinking, and perhaps you mentioned enough of it as well. So some of us sitting in this audience also kind of deny to think scientifically, and maybe today we are sitting in IIT, and the entire crowd of IIT, I have enough of friends who also deny to think scientifically, or who deny to think maybe at times as well, who believe in believing, not maybe thinking or critically questioning. So, I mean, what is your experience, or what is the approach that you normally would suggest, or as in to kind of propagate scientific thinking and argue about? Thank you.
So, according to me, any sort of thinking at the end of the day can be traced down to an act of faith. Whether you are believing something that's written in a scientific book, like a physics textbook, or whether it's something written in some holy scripture. The difference, I think, lies in what is known as technology. If Einstein tells me that space-time curves around a massive object, that idea is as ridiculous to me as, let's say, as the Noah's Ark, for example. Now, why I believe in general relativity and not the myths of religion is because of technology, because my GPS works when I try to navigate around the world. So I think that the perspective of the technology is an interface by which a common man